I want to confirm that we have worked very closely with the Sri Lankan authorities to see 20 people off a boat returned back to Colombo. We've worked very closely with the Sri Lankans over a period of time, and it's been very effective. And I want people smugglers in all, not just our country, but all parts of our region to hear this very clear message. Under the Morrison government, the re-elected Morrison government, our policies on boats haven't changed. There will be no softening of our border protection measures, and people will be returned back to their country of origin, as we've demonstrated in very quick succession over the course of the last 24 hours or so. I want to just go to a couple of details. Firstly, it's clear that people smugglers are marketing Australia, and we warned of this before the election. The second point is that there seems to be some chatter around that the Sri Lankans might have changed their position, or that Australia's changed its position and that we won't send people back to Sri Lanka. That is not the case. As I've said, people need to be very clear. That is that we will be returning people who seek to come to our country by boat. We don't want kids back in detention, we don't want people drowning at sea, and we don't want to return back to those bad Labor days. It's clear to me that the people smugglers anticipated a shortened Labor government, and no doubt they'll be disappointed by the fact that that didn't happen. But we have worked very hard in the past to clean up Labor's mess, and we are in the midst of a difficult period now as well, because obviously people were believing that there was going to be a change of government, and that the soft policy that Mr Shorten took to the last election would somehow be an open door, as we predicted it would be portrayed as being, and we need to be very clear about all of that in relation to this latest venture. Today is the day that Mr Albanese also needs to come out and distance himself from Bill Shorten's weak border protection policies. For whatever reason, Mr Shorten decided to take a cut-down version at best to the last election of Operation Sovereign Borders. Labor's been warned about this before, not to put in place a policy which weakens our border protection, but that's exactly what Bill Shorten, Anthony Albanese and others within the leadership team of the Labor Party did at the last election. So let's be very clear. Mr Albanese needs to come out today, distance himself from Mr Shorten's failed policy, and he needs to make very clear that he supports the government's strong position on border protection. Mr Albanese also needs to come out and give an assurance that when Parliament returns in the first week in July, that he will support the government in the abolition of the disastrous medivac bill, because that is a pull factor for people on boats as well. So let's be very clear about what the Labor Party stood for in the run-up to the election and what they now really need to make sure that they change, and Mr Albanese needs to be very clear about that today. I'm happy to take any questions.
Mr Dutton, do you think this vote perhaps was a test of the newly elected government?
No doubt in my mind it was a test, and we predicted this before the election, that Labor went to the election with a watered-down version, at best really an abolition of Operation Sovereign Borders as we know it. And the reality is that people smugglers heard that message, and the Australian public heard that message. And it's now time for Mr Albanese to hear the message as well, to say that Mr Shorten made a mistake. The Labor Party needs to be honest. Mr Albanese was up here in Queensland only a couple of days ago, wanting to know what had happened in Queensland. Well, Queenslanders, like the rest of Australia, don't trust Labor on boats. And Mr Albanese needs to distance himself from Mr Shorten's policy and come out and say today that the Labor Party stands for every element of Operation Sovereign Borders, because that's what stopped the boats, and it's what's kept them stopped.
Minister, can you tell us why you're so strongly persuaded that this was a test of your return to Australian government?
Well, there's no doubt that people smugglers have been telling innocent men, women and children that are willing to hop on a boat that the circumstances will change if there's a Labor government. They know that the Labor Party's been tested before, and 50,000 people came on 800 boats. 1,200 people tragically drowned at sea. So the people smugglers, I think, like the Australian public, have worked out very clearly that Labor does stand for softening of our borders, and the border policy that Mr Shorten took to the last election is a disaster. And it's clear to all of us that Labor has to get their house in order, and this should be one of the first tests for Mr Albanese.
Can you explain how they were brought to Christmas Island?
I'm not going to go into to that level of operational detail, but we've been very clear that we can either return people on vessel, either their own vessel one of ours. We can return by air, and we have a number of options available to us as to how we can effect a return of people, what the most efficient way to do that is in the circumstances, and we took that decision in relation to this particular venture.
Were extra border force and naval assets deployed to borders in Australia's northwest around the time of the election?
Yes, they were, and the bureaucracy took that decision during the caretaker phase that they would deploy more assets within the region, both in terms of aerial surveillance as well as on water assets, and that's the decision that they took.
Do you think perhaps this is the only boat, and with this one arriving, has there been any change to the operations in Northern Australia?
This is not the only boat, I'm sorry to say. I am worried about a number of issues at the moment, which I'm not going to elaborate on today, but this is not the only boat that we're concerned about, not the only venture that people are working on, and we're working very closely with authorities right across the region, but including in Sri Lanka as well, and we'll continue that work because I'm not going to allow the boats to restart, and we've been very decisive in the action we've taken in relation to this boat, and I commend the officers of Australian Border Force as well as the Australian Defence Force as well, but this issue is not going away. People smugglers, as we've predicted for a long time, have not gone away. They remain in business, and we need to make sure that we can stare down this threat.
Minister, how can you be certain that this venture was not related to fear of Islamic extremist terrorism in Sri Lanka?
Well, look, I'm not going to go into to the intelligence or to the information that we receive either before the election or since, and you wouldn't expect me to do that. But I think people can be very clear about the fact that people smugglers have the Labor Party worked out. They did it the last time they were in government. There were 50,000 people that came and 1,200 people drowned at sea, and that they would expect the same from an incoming Shorten government after they had said that they would water down and abolish elements of Operation Sovereign Borders. Should come as no surprise that these boats went to sea and that they were going to test out a Labor government. There's no surprise in any of that.
How close do they get to Australia?
Well, I should. It's a good question. So I want to deal with that issue. That the vessel in question didn't make it to Christmas Island. I've seen some reporting of that today, and there was a suggestion that people were detained on Christmas Island in the immigration detention centre there. That's not the case either.
On the centre, when do you intend to close that?
Well, look, again, we'll make decisions in due course. We're very worried about this medivac bill. We've never denied people the medical assistance that they require, and people have always come ultimately to Australia if that's what's required to get the medical attention that they need. This was always a stunt conducted by the Greens and Labor, facilitated by Karen Phelps, who was then a Member of Parliament. And we're worried that that sends a very clear signal that people can come by an alternate means to our country, and we've been very clear in making sure that that's not the case, and we expect the Labor Party to support us in abolishing the medivac bill. We took that policy very clearly to the election, and the Labor Party should honour the will of the Australian people.
How many people have come to Australia under that legislation?
Well, only a small number, because my judgment is that people were waiting for a Labor government to be elected, and their view was that they would come en masse under the Labor Party. Mr Shorten was very clear about the fact that people would come in big numbers from Manus and Nauru to Australia, and the result of that would have been just another green light for people smugglers. The way in which Labor were proposing to do that was reckless, and perhaps that's what's fed into this latest venture.
Under new arrangements, you're taking charge of migrant and cut-off education and services. Why are these activities being taken from the Education Department and Social Services?
Well, the Prime Minister's been very clear that we want to create jobs for Australians. We want people to go into jobs, and we have a wonderful history in our country of the contribution of migrants who have come here over many decades out of war-torn Europe, off the back of the Vietnam War, during the period of other conflicts, Tiananmen Square. People that have come from all four corners of the globe have come here to contribute an enormous amount to our country. But in some pockets we find that there are high unemployment high unemployment rates, high welfare dependency. I want to make sure, the Prime Minister wants to make sure, that we can get people into a job as quickly as possible, and the work in particular of Minister Coleman will be to provide greater coordination of government services, working with our colleagues to help people not into welfare but into a job. And we know that people from the Middle East or from China, from Asia, wherever they might come, they are entrepreneurial people. They want to work, they've escaped difficult circumstances, war-ravaged country in the case of Syria or Iraq, for example. They want to live in a peaceful country that we provide. They want to educate their kids, they want to get into jobs themselves and create a future that their parents or grandparents could never have imagined. So I think we give ourselves a better chance under the new arrangements to make sure that that's the case.
What would you say then to refugee advocates who are concerned there might need to be a cultural shift? You're very focused on border security. How will you handle migration?
Well, I think we've shown in the Home Affairs portfolio that if we're tasked with a particular job, we get it done. And I think that's why the Prime Minister wants us to, as a portfolio, be able to provide whatever assistance we can to help people into a job as quickly as possible. And it doesn't matter whether people have come from a migrant background or people have been born here. The Prime Minister's been very clear about the jobs priority of this government. We've done it for young people, particularly over the last 12 months, where we've created jobs, we've helped people leave school or leave university or leave TAFE or vocational education otherwise and go into a job. We want the economy to grow and we want everybody to benefit from that, including newly arrived Australians. And there's a better chance of integration as well if people are working and not leading a life of welfare. The same principles apply to people that have recently arrived into our country as they do for people who are long-term residents. So there's a lot of sense, and I think the Prime Minister's looked to our department, looked to Minister Coleman in particular, because he knows that we'll be able to deliver this for the government.
Minister, the ABC 730 has spoken to a US immigration judge who presided over the case of two Rwandans brought to Australia from the US, and he concluded they posed a risk to the safety and security of the US. How was it that Australia decided that they were not a danger here?
Well, I made comments in relation to this matter a couple of weeks ago, and I don't intend to add to it except to say this. Our government would never bring somebody to our country unless we had the advice of the intelligence and law enforcement agencies, and we've done that in cases, and we act on that advice. So we're not allowing people into our country who pose a threat, and there are all sorts of measures that we can put in place to protect the Australian people. We do it every day, and we'll continue to do that. And but in relation to the issues otherwise, I just don't have any comment to make.
In terms of Parliament sitting in July, do you have any priorities in terms of legislation?
Well, certainly from my perspective, we want the temporary exclusion orders bill passed. We've got people who want to return to our country as foreign fighters. We've got people that have trained up with ISIL. They've been front and centre on the battlefield for ISIL in the Middle East, particularly in Syria. And we have looked at the UK model, which has worked very well. And we need to deal with each of these cases on an individual basis. But the temporary exclusion order arrangement, as operates in the UK, allows us an extra opportunity to delay somebody's return to Australia if that's appropriate in the circumstances. And the Labor Party wouldn't support that in the last Parliament, and we are going to proceed with that bill. And we obviously would very much like an indication from Mr Albanese early on as to whether or not Labor has changed their position and they'll now support that bill. The abolition of the medivac bill is also a priority for the government because we think it's a bill that undermines, or a law that undermines the settings of Operation Sovereign Borders, and we'll have other legislative priorities in other portfolios, including of course tax cuts, as the Prime Minister's pointed out. All right, thanks guys, thank you.